and depth of seriousness that the police are taking in this matter and are using to address the very real problems in communities to ensure that we keep burglaries to a minimum and to start to reduce or continue to reduce them. We're now moving on to consider metal thefts, which is a matter that's been nationally raised up the agenda, and Superintendent Billy Hotchkiss is here to give us a presentation on this. Chief Superintendent Billy Hotchkiss, sorry.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity of coming to talk to the Police Authority about the problem of metal theft. I've been the metal theft lead for South Yorkshire Police since 2006, so it's a subject that was certainly close to my heart as a crime manager at Doncaster before moving into my current role in the Human Resources Directorate. What I'm going to talk today about is the problem of metal theft and give you some idea when the technology works. Is it? Oh, sorry, right.
Use the keyboard, Billy. Keyboard on the desk.
Right.
So use the keyboard, but you might have to.
That's further forward, isn't it? It's gone further forward, that, yeah. It's no problem. I can start at that point and move through. Sorry about that. The stolen metal market in the UK has been estimated to cost UK industry and the national infrastructure between the region of £780 million to £1 billion a year. So you can imagine that we're dealing with significant problems here across the entire UK, not just in South Yorkshire. In terms of the export market for metals, that's worth around £3.7 million a year. So we export, on average, £3.7 billion worth of metal outside the UK, which shows it can be potentially a massive problem. What I'm going to talk about is obviously the background. We know that global demand for metal is increasing, and that's fueled by economies such as South Africa, India, China and Dubai, and obviously the infrastructure build as we've seen for the London Olympics, and that's clearly fueling the problem around metal theft. Now that leads to concerns from members of the public who obviously have their intranet supply lines disrupted. We get impacts upon businesses caused by the loss of power and BT lines as we've seen recently. And also utility companies, British Telecom, Yorkshire Water and Sea Electric are now starting to see significant problems, not just in South Yorkshire, but nationally. South Yorkshire and many surrounding forces, and obviously across the UK, have seen large increases in the problem of metal theft. Luckily, in South Yorkshire, we've got a crime management system that can accurately track metal theft offences. We've got a search facility that enables us to track which offences, whether that be burglary dwellings or theft others or burglaries, have got an element of metal theft attached to them. So we are one of the few forces in the UK that can accurately give you the picture about why metal theft is increasing on what scale. The chart there, which I know may be a little bit difficult to read for people at the back, gives you some idea of how the problem has moved since 2008 through to July this year. The top line, the blue line, shows the force-wide figure, which gives you an indication that in April 2008, when the first recession started to hit, you'll see the problem significantly reduced, down to some very low levels, below 100 offences. Now, since then, as the economic picture started to change, we've seen the pattern of metal theft start to move up, certainly in an upward direction, until we get to around November 2010. And in November 2010, the problem significantly dropped, just for a 2 or 3 week period. We started to scratch our heads in terms of why that happened, and then realised that if you think about the same period last year to where we are now, there was a blanket of snow, not only covering South Yorkshire, but also covering the UK. Now that gives you some idea that metal theft is very much a mobile problem. where we're getting people travelling across the county and beyond, stealing metal, and obviously the fact that scrap metal yards weren't able to open and operate normally had a massive impact on metal theft. So myself and other members of the senior command team are practising our snow dance for this year in terms of impacting on metal theft. But since then, the problem of metal theft has come back and it has risen. There's been some stabilisation recently before July because we've had a number of operations in various districts, which has obviously impacted on the problem. The figures below are broken down by various districts, and you'll see that while we've had some stabilisation and drops in some districts, in Sheffield in particular, where there are a high number of scrap metal yards, the problem has started to rise again. We know, as Bob Sanderson's touched on already, that the scrap metal market is very much an attraction for criminals because of the cash-based nature of the industry. The Scrap Metal Dealers Act of 1964, which we know is a very old piece of legislation, needs to be changed, and there's a lot of lobbying going on at the moment to try and change that legislation, as I'll talk about later. But because of the cash-based nature of the industry, that's an attraction for criminals. So it is an area of crime that criminals move into. We've also got the potential to damage local and national infrastructure, and I'm sure people in this room have suffered delays on local train systems and transport systems caused by the problem of cable theft. And we do know from our intelligence picture there are some strong links to organised crime, particularly those criminals that are involved in travelling from South Yorkshire into other parts of the country and bringing metal back into South Yorkshire. What we want to do as part of our strategy is avoid headlines like this. Now, this isn't something that happened in South Yorkshire, it's a headline from Leeds, but clearly from our publicity, what we want to do is try and raise the dangers of the problem of being involved in metal theft, particularly young people who may not be aware of the dangers as much as older people, and therefore, you know, we don't want people being killed or seriously injured. And lots of our media campaigns are actually directed towards reducing this problem. I'm an active member of the ACPO National Conductive Metals Group. That group is chaired by the Deputy Chief Constable of the British Transport Police, and obviously that is a real key group in terms of changing the legislation nationally in relation to the Scrap Metal Dealers Act. I've also developed the South Yorkshire Metal Theft Group, where we have representation from metal theft leads in every district in South Yorkshire, and obviously key partners as well. We conduct many number of proactive operations to target metal theft, predominantly targeted around locations of scrap metal dealers, but also at key locations on particular roads where we know the intelligence is telling us that movement of metal occurs, you know, whether that be on a particular evening or during a particular time of the day. And days of action, we have days of action locally, and also we take part in national days of action, and that's usually coordinated through the ACPO Conductive Metals Group. There is a resourcing challenge, obviously. We touched on already about falling numbers of police officers, and that's a significant challenge for us in relation to putting the level of resources that we want to into tackling the problem of metal theft. And obviously district commanders and command teams have got other priorities around burglary offences, theft offences, criminal damage, antisocial behaviour, and metal theft is another problem that they obviously need to manage. Current work in South Yorkshire. We've developed a new training package both for staff in South Yorkshire, and this has been circulated on a regional basis and also has been circulated on a national basis to other forces who have contacted us about work that's occurring in South Yorkshire. This is an example of a cable theft guide that's issued to officers to give them some idea of what kind of types of cable are stolen, what the core of cable looks like. We know that criminals try and disguise cable by burning it off, and obviously it still leaves the core element of the copper that's still there. So these cable theft guides are issued to operational officers, so if they do stop a vehicle that contains cable, or they do check a scrap metal yard and they find cable, it gives them some idea of where it's from, and the identification can lead to positive results in terms of arrests and prosecutions. I have involvement in a European project called the Paul Primat project, which is police and private partnerships to tackle metal theft. What we know from that project is that the problem of metal theft is not just confined to South Yorkshire. It's already got some European dimensions. We know that countries such as Bulgaria, Italy, France, Germany, they all suffer these similar kind of problems to the UK. We know, for example, that in Italy, the organised criminality around the mafia are involved in metal theft because there is such a rich return on it. So it gives us some experience working on a European level that some of the tactics that we use in South Yorkshire can equally be shared amongst other European countries. And vice versa, the tactics that's used in other European countries, then potentially we can use them in the UK. As an example, the training package that we developed in South Yorkshire, that has been shared with the Paul Premet project and obviously will now be shared with European partners and law enforcement agencies in other countries. I also chair the Force Regional Metal Theft meeting, where we have the Force leads from North Yorkshire, South Yorkshire and Humberside, and obviously key partners such as Sea Electric, Yorkshire Water, British Telecom, that come to our regional meetings, which we have on a 4-weekly basis, where again we share knowledge, good practice and intelligence. We have a number of district operations. 2 examples on there are Operation Cinderford and Operation Cobalt, which were directed at the Rotherham district. And we know that when we do put the resources into metal theft operations, Operation Cinderford, for example, within 3 days of the operation starting, we had 31 arrests and recovered nearly £200,000 of the stolen cable from either BT or Network Rail cable. So it shows the extent of the problem by concentrating resources in one particular area. The other problem we have is that when we do recover stolen metal from acquisitive criminals, the common excuse that people use is, well, I've found this length of cable in a hedge bottom, or I found it at the side of the road. If we're not able to identify that metal, it makes it quite difficult for us to prove the actual offence. So working with the Crown Prosecution Service, what we've done is developed a minimum standards of investigation document. And this is an example of the document here. And what that enables us to do is to work with our staff to ensure that they capture all the evidence gathering opportunities they can when they're investigating offences of metal theft. So they're taking photographs of the actual metal, they're doing the best they possibly can to identify the metal, and the interview plan is such that it asks the relevant questions in the interview that enables a package to be presented to the Crown Prosecution Service, which will lead to increased prosecutions. The regional metal theft group that I talked about gives us that capability to share information and intelligence. We know that British Telecom and Yorkshire Water and other agencies are now very, very much geared up by employing their own analysts in relation to sharing information and intelligence with other law enforcement agencies. And that group is seen very much as a foreman and giving us that capability to share that information. We've just developed a crime mapping system. So the crime mapping system that we currently use in South Yorkshire for burglary, antisocial behaviour and criminal damage, metal theft offences have now been placed onto that mapping system. So that enables district commanders to look at metal theft offences on a daily basis, look at the patterns, where the hotspots are, and it enables us to divert resources to those particular areas where the metal theft offences are occurring. In each district we have metal theft champions, Doncaster, Rotherham, Barnsley and Sheffield, and they're very much seen as the coordinators of activity within their local areas. So they'll be responsible for organising days of actions and operations, and also looking at implementing the metal theft strategy which we've got operating within South Yorkshire. We have a red, amber and green classification strategy in relation to scrap metal yards. As one example, in Rotherham district alone, there are nearly 69 scrap metal dealers. Now that's a large number of dealers to try and police and coordinate in one particular area with the district resources, so it's quite a challenge. So what we do is we classify the actual dealers according to a red, amber and green matrix, and bear in mind any intelligence that's received about that particular yard, or if we do checks and we find we're not happy with the record keeping at those particular books, then what we'll do is we'll place them on the red matrix, which shows that that's an activity, that's a yard that requires an increased area of activity in relation to policing resources. So they get a number of visits on a regular basis determined by the picture of intelligence. And this next slide gives you some example of what that red, amber, green matrix looks like for some selected yards. The grey ones is where the intelligence picture is being updated. But the amber ones is where you've got a better level of compliance, and obviously there's a reduced number of visits to that particular yard. And the green ones gives you some picture that actually we do have yards, and they are legitimate businesses out there that's run properly, who do cooperate with the police, do share information, and do keep good records in their books. So those yards that are green on the green matrix don't get as many visits as some of the others that are highlighted. Future plans. Obviously what South Yorkshire Police wants to do is look at the areas of reducing rewards to offenders, looking at the cash-based nature of the industry, trying to join the national campaign to have that cash-based nature reduced, remove offenders' excuses, so if they do find metal and try and come up with a lame excuse, we do our very best to take that excuse away. Increase the risk of arrest and prosecution. That's got a very high deterrent value amongst the criminal fraternity. If they know, for example, they face a risk of arrest and prosecution, and we're working with the courts at the moment to look at better sentences for offenders by using things such as impact statements from some of the utility companies to say actually that although that item that was stolen was relatively low in value, the actual impact on our business led to many, many thousands of pounds being spent in terms of repairing it. So we're preparing impact statements that can be shared with the court to show the true extent and nature of the problem. And obviously what we want to do through some of the diversionary activities and some of the work that's ongoing to look for alternative methods of using things like an alternative to lead for church roofs, an alternative to copper, whether that be plastic pipes or whatever it may be. We want to increase the effort required to steal that metal. And obviously through the various groups that I talked about, and the National Metal Group and the European project that we're involved in South Yorkshire, we want to identify and disseminate best practice as much as we can. Longer term opportunities. Clearly we want to continue with our proactive publicity campaign. After every policing operation we try and run a proactive campaign, whether that be by radio, by TV, by some of the social media outlets, highlighting what the results are and what the police are doing about the problem. What we also are very keen to do, and I don't want to steal Gwyn's thunder because Gwyn's going to be talking about the new LifeWise Centre, but in the new LifeWise Centre we've actually got a mocked up electricity substation that's fitted in there. The idea of that is we can start to educate young people about the dangers of either being involved in metal theft, or we do get a substation on occasions that's been broken into which is insecure. There's obviously some grave dangers about younger children straying into these locations because the padlock's obviously been damaged. That is a real issue for us from a public safety point of view. So the LifeWise Centre is being used to educate children and young people about the dangers of metal theft and about the dangers of playing near to electricity. But Gwyn will talk about that in more detail during his presentation. We talked already about sharing information with business partners on a local, regional and national level, because we do know through our intelligence picture that criminals are prepared to travel long distances in order to commit offences. They will travel into rural areas, come back into South Yorkshire to dispose of the metal, so it's really, really important that we share information with our partners and colleagues in other forces. Respond to legislation changes. Baroness Browning is the Crime Prevention Minister in the Home Office. She, working with the ACPO Conductive Metals Group, is pulling together some changes to the legislation to update the 1964 Scrap Metal Dealers Act. Some of the issues they're looking at is to remove the cash-based nature of the industry, to insist that we install video recording at scrap metal dealers on the weighbridge, so we've got an electronic record of who's going in and who's going out, to ensure that identification is produced and presented, whether that be a driving licence or passport, making it mandatory that every scrapyard deals in this kind of way. And also, importantly for us, giving potentially the police the power to close down premises that either aren't operating effectively, we find evidence that we have stolen metal in their particular yards, and clearly if we can close down the premises, that's a real strong weight in our armour in terms of closing down these premises and impacting on the problem, and obviously puts the fear into the scrap metal dealers that aren't complying with the legislation, that actually I face the threat if I don't comply of having my premises closed down. So we're quite excited about these potential changes because it gives us some tremendous powers there. It will help us to control the problem. That legislation is probably at least 12 months away, so in the meantime we need to continue with our current practices. Obviously, what we want to do is reduce crime. When you see some of the figures, I'm not proud of those figures, and I don't think anybody else is. You know, it's something that we need to reduce and put all our efforts and resources into actually reducing the problem. So that's something we want to do in the future. And clearly, working with our partners who are suffering big losses in relation to this, which has obviously impacted on people's utility bills at this current time. It's not good news for anybody, but let's try and reduce those company losses as much as we possibly can, working with our partners. And clearly, if we carry on doing this, that will improve partner confidence in our policing activity and obviously public confidence as well. So that's the end of the presentation. It's giving you an overview about what the problem is, but also, more importantly, what South Yorkshire Police are doing in terms of our strategy to tackle the problem of metal theft. And I'm quite happy to answer any questions that people may have.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation, Bill. Comments and questions from members?
Chairman.
John?
Thanks for that, Bill. That was incredibly interesting and a good presentation too. I'm particularly interested because clearly you're doing a tremendous amount of work and the force is doing a lot of work around the authority. But I'd like to know where the hotspots are in South Yorkshire, and I'd also like to know how many individuals have been arrested and what sort of sentence they've received as a result of that, because I sense that this is a massive problem, but it's perhaps not being taken as seriously as it should be by magistrates' courts, etc.
Well, from the perspective of arrests and convictions, I can supply those figures to the authority. I've not put them in the paper, but I can certainly give you the figures for South Yorkshire. In terms of hotspots, the crime mapping system tells us, and the figures tell you on the presentation there, that Sheffield is a particular hotspot for us at the moment. Doncaster has been a hotspot in relation to some offences in relation to BT cable thefts, but a lot of the districts are doing some very proactive work in relation to tackling that problem, working with BT, and also some good arrests have occurred recently in relation to that particular issue. But the hotspots are centred across South Yorkshire, but I can give you details of those if you'd like to show them, and probably demonstrate at the same time the crime mapping system that we've got online.
Sean, if I may, Sean, one of the things that we've realised that we had to do more work at making sure that both the CPS and the magistrates were cited on the impact of metal theft. So, somebody turns up with 30 quid worth of copper cable stolen. If you're just sentencing them on the fact that they've got £30 worth of stolen copper, then they're not likely to get a particularly draconian sentence. But what we're doing is all the district commanders have put in impact statements which says, actually, and you just look at Bob's old area in Doncaster, Moor Ends, a lot of people and businesses lost their internet connections out there for days at a time. And so you've got these issues around vulnerable people who perhaps, if they've got a medical problem, need to be monitored remotely or need to have their access to a telephone. You've got people who run their businesses. So we've done that work around alerting magistrates and CPS via what we call impact statements as to the nature of the problem. It's not just the value of the metal, it's the disruption to the community. Bill mentioned it in his presentation. One of the frustrations that we've had is that, again, theft by finding is a perfectly legitimate tactic for us to use. I found this copper piping in the bottom of a hedgerow, and therefore I just picked it up, and I was going to hand it in, but nobody was around. All this sort of nonsense. Well, actually, the sort of, as you've seen, the sort of the template that we've put out gives people a clear set of tactics to employ, what questions to ask in an interview, what they've got to do about where did you find it? Go and take a photograph. How likely is that? We've done a lot of work at trying to ensure that we can actually give the CPS the confidence to actually progress with a charge of theft by finding. I don't say there isn't more to do, but actually making sure that people understand it's not just the value of the stuff that's stolen, but the wider impact is very clearly going to have, I think, influenced sentencing decisions, and that's what we're trying to do.
And that's exactly the point I was trying to get at. That's exactly the point I was trying to get at, Chairman, that actually it is being viewed as the value of the metal stolen as opposed to the impact that the stealing has on the wider community. And I just think that perhaps we need to highlight one or two offenders in the media over the coming weeks and months, just to say, look, you know, this is what you can expect as a result of this, because I haven't actually seen any press articles around this issue of late, and we just need to be constantly sending the message out. Clearly it's on the wrong side of the trajectory at the moment with the increase, and because it's an area of growth insofar as crime's concerned, we need to be on the ball in terms of media communication and getting the message out there.
I agree. To be fair to the judiciary, I'm aware that Judge Kelson, who's a senior judge at Sheffield Crown Court, is working with Crown Prosecution Service at the moment to circulate correspondence to magistrates and other Crown Courts in the South Yorkshire area, highlighting the problem of metal theft and actually touching upon some of the points that Mr Holtz mentioned in relation to the impact statements and actually the true impact of metal theft and the true cost to our communities.
Going to just say on that point that there are two key elements that magistrates take into account in sentencing. One is culpability and the other is the harm. But the extent of the harm needs to be presented to the magistrates so that they understand that. And so what Andy Holt and Bill are saying is actually by providing that in some detail, then the magistrates have got a much clearer picture of the impact of this particular offence, even if the intrinsic value of the theft is relatively small. And it's really important that that comes to the courts. John, you wanted to come in?
Chair, thanks, Bill. Excellent presentation, and obviously gives more information to base our understanding, and we can integrate it into our practice in terms of how we relate that to others. But I recognise the good work of Centreford and is it Cobalt, the operations, and the amount of money that's actually being returned. But likewise, I'm mindful that to actually carry out large operations like what you're doing and the amount of work that's being done, that you're trying to follow the diversity of the criminals, where they diversify from one activity into another. Where are the police actually being drawn from for that level of work now, given the increase in the nature of the criminality in that particular respect? Is it from the safer neighbourhood teams? Because at this moment in time, what we've got to try and do is keep up public confidence and satisfaction. And yes, these are critical areas, and we'll keep tracing drugs, metal thefts, but at the end of the day, we know in South Yorkshire that we are getting one hell of a slap with 400 staff coming off our streets. How do we actually maintain the quality service that we actually provide? We've got quality officers that do a brilliant job, but at the end of the day, where are we falling short? Is it within our communities? Are they the ones that are going to be bereft of the quality support that they've had in the past? Is this just an indicator of the future?
You're quite right to highlight, where is the resource coming from? And the resource in South Yorkshire is coming from a variety of places. Safer neighbourhood teams, as you mentioned, are an important resource to us. Safer neighbourhood teams have had the training input in relation to checking the yards, making sure they visit on a daily basis, looking for the names that appear in the book, which is really useful intelligence to us, looking at some of the vehicles that's coming in on a regular basis, which is then fed into the intelligence unit and then shared with other officers in South Yorkshire. Our patrol staff and response teams, at the street skills training that they get, we give them inputs about what to look for when tackling metal theft. So you've got police patrols that are actively targeting metal theft, stopping vehicles, checking for such offences as insurance offences, waste carry licence offences. We've got regional policing teams that come in and are involved and support our policing operations. We've also got lots of partners such as the Environment Agency, local authority, British Transport Police that come and actually we run a coordinated effort, and it's a little bit like a production line, John, where we'll stop a vehicle at one point, and as it starts to run through, we're dipping tanks for red diesel, they're being checked for DHSS offences, and by the time they get to the end, I can really assure you they've been through the mill. But also, from the organised crime point of view, we have a lot of CID resources and detectives that are looking not just at the, the small-scale crime, but also some of the larger criminality, which involve larger sums of money and some of the money laundering aspects as well. So we've got resources from across South Yorkshire. We've got RPG resources that assist in operations, and also some regional teams. So it isn't just focused on one area, it's actually focused across the board. But as you're right to point out, and the presentation does, it is a challenge for us.
Thanks for the presentation, very good. From what you were saying, I think the biggest change that's going to make a difference is going to be the change to the law. Yeah. So when that comes in, I think that will really help support you deliver more results in this area. You talked about working with partners and primarily utility companies, and I think you mentioned local authorities. I'd be interested in what role the local authorities are playing in part of this strategy, especially in relation to the drain covers on the roads and pavements every so often are missing, and which obviously could have a big problem with people walking and falling into them.
Yeah. Well, local authorities are involved on different levels as well. Local authorities actually issue the scrap metal dealer licence, but there is no revenue attached to that at the moment in relation to local authorities being encouraged to put resources into policing the licensing side of scrap metal dealers. Because what we do have as well, and there's evidence to support it, we do have unlicensed scrap metal dealers out there, and clearly local authorities and police have the power to investigate such offences and take some action against them. Now, the legislation changes I talked about through Baroness Browning, one of the proposals there as well is to actually attach a levy to the licence fee, which will enable local authorities to draw off some revenue, which may pay for some resource to be put into the problem. In relation to the covers, drain covers that's stolen from the side of the roads, clearly they're reported to us, and local authorities work very closely with the police in relation to engaging our activities about how we can reduce the problem. One example being, do we need to refit a metal drain cover, or can we fit plastic covers that do exactly the same job but are not as attractive to criminals, because that's one option. And also the local authority resources are involved in our scrap metal operations as well. So, they do feed into us, and we share information on a regular basis. Got a very, very good relationship with local authorities across South Yorkshire.
I'd like to thank you for the presentation and the work that you and your team are doing. In particular, the minimum standard of investigation, I think that's really good, and I think it helps officers from wherever they've come from to actually ask the right questions and mark down what is needed. So I'm very happy and very pleased to accept that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Just a comment in relation to the comments that you made, John, just to give you some reassurance. I think that the point that you were making or trying to make is, as this problem continues, and if we continue to see increases, your worry is that we abstract key community-based S&T resources, tackle metal theft, and that in effect may have a negative impact in relation to some of the other work that they do. I mean, the way that we work that is that we try to make sure that the S&T involvement is at the minimum end in terms of intelligence gathering. So, for instance, every scrap metal dealer lives on somebody's community. So it's absolutely right that the S&Ts are involved in gathering intelligence and creating good engagement with scrap metal dealers and the people that might be involved in that sort of offending. But what they don't do is get involved in long-winded operations for days on end, and they don't also get involved in some of the more time-consuming aspects of dealing with prisoners. So their involvement is very much about the reassurance and the intelligence gathering in the communities. If prisoners are generated, somebody else deals with them so that the SNTs can continue to do their work in communities. Because I think that if we saw this as significantly and predominantly an SNT-based problem, you won't see many SNT resources doing the day-to-day community engagement that you see at the moment. So it's a bit of a balancing act. They have a role to play, but I'm conscious that we can't take them off to deal with metal theft because it's far more complex than just an SNT issue.
Bob, I welcome your comments, because the comments were meant for that purpose, so somebody would actually pick it up, and I'm pleased you picked it up. One of my concerns on the streets is that the police provide an excellent service. However, there's a limited resource in terms of manpower, given the way the crime has actually changed and the nature of crime. Because what I'm seeing in our streets is an increase in the opportunist thieves, on the streets, because there is a limited force. We don't see the police walking the streets. and we understand why. But at the end of the day, this is to recognise that the nature of criminality has changed, and there's a need for us to change in the way our thinking is. All I'm concerned is customer satisfaction on the ground in terms of understanding what is going on in our communities. And all this is one abstraction after another. I'm pleased it's de minimis in the scheme of things, because the number of officers on the street have decreased dramatically in terms of the operational availability to our communities from the Safer Neighbourhood teams. You know as well in Doncaster it's changed from 16 neighbourhood teams when it first started off just to a handful. Equally so, the complement of manpower has changed.